The silence in the apartment on the 14th floor of the Bronx high-rise was absolute, a comforting blanket that Elena had worn all her life. Outside, the December wind howled against the brickwork, and inside, the radiator clanked with a rhythm she could feel through the soles of her feet. But to her ears, the world was a void of peaceful stillness. She moved through the small living room, the lights of the Christmas tree casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling beige paint, unaware that 3 floors below, a faulty lithium-ion battery had just exploded, igniting a mattress and sending a column of superheated toxicity shooting up the ventilation shaft. Elena checked the lock on the front door, her hand lingering on the cold metal, feeling nothing but the subtle vibration of the subway passing blocks away, a tremor she had learned to distinguish from all others. In the nursery, 10-month-old Leo was asleep, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that Eleanor monitored with her hand, her palm resting gently on his back to confirm the life flowing through him. She did not hear the first siren wail in the distance, nor did she hear the shattering of glass as a window on the 11th floor blew out from the pressure of the heat. The building's fire alarm system, old and poorly maintained, began to scream in the hallway, a piercing mechanical shriek that woke the neighbors in a panic, but inside apartment 14B, the air remained undisturbed by sound. Elena adjusted Leo's blanket, tucking the edges around his small frame, her eyes heavy with exhaustion from a double shift at the textile factory, completely oblivious to the fact that the corridor outside was rapidly filling with black, acrid smoke. She went to her own bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar so she could see the flashing light of the baby monitor if Leo cried, though the monitor did not pick up the frequency of the fire alarm. As she washed her face in the bathroom, the water running over her hands masked the subtle vibrations of footsteps pounding in the stairwell as families fled. It was the smell that reached her first, not a sound, but a heavy, intrusive scent that bypassed her deafness and struck a primal chord of danger in her brain. It was the smell of burning plastic and old wood, thick and chemical, seeping through the gaps around the plumbing fixtures and slithering under the front door like a dark serpent. Elena froze, water dripping from her chin, her senses suddenly shifting into a state of hyper-awareness that compensated for her lack of hearing. She turned off the faucet and placed her hands flat against the bathroom wall, closing her eyes to focus on the tactile feedback of the building's structure. The vibrations were wrong. They were frantic, irregular thuds that shook the plaster, distinct from the rhythmic mechanical hum of the city. She stepped into the hallway of her apartment and saw it, a thin grey tendril of smoke curling lazily near the ceiling light fixture, ghostly and silent, a visual betrayal of the safety she thought she possessed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a sensation so violent it felt like a second drum inside her chest as she rushed to the front door to check the peephole. The metal of the doorknob was warm, not hot yet, but unnervingly warm, a temperature that sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Looking through the fisheye lens, her breath caught in her throat. The hallway, usually lit by fluorescent tubes, was a churning sea of black smoke, illuminated only by the flickering, hellish orange glow of flames eating the carpet further down the corridor. The realization hit her with physical force. The fire was not just in the building, it was on her floor, and the escape route to the stairwell was already compromised. She backed away from the door, the silence of her world now terrifying rather than comforting, as it masked the roar of the inferno that she knew must be deafening on the other side. Panic threatened to paralyze her legs, a cold weight attempting to anchor her to the floorboards. But the image of Leo in the next room shattered the fear into immediate, desperate action. She ran to the nursery, her bare feet slapping against the wood, her eyes scanning the room for signs of smoke intrusion. Leo was still asleep, innocent and unaware, his small face illuminated by the streetlights outside, oblivious to the fact that his mother was calculating the seconds they had left to live. Eleanor grabbed the baby monitor and threw it on the bed, her hands trembling as she reached for Leo, pulling him from the crib with an urgency that made him stir and open his eyes. He began to cry, his mouth opening in a wail she could not hear, but she felt the vibration of his distress against her chest and saw the redness flushing his cheeks. She held him tight, pressing his face into her shoulder to shield him from the sight of her own terror, knowing that he looked to her for cues on how to react to the world. She needed to be calm, she needed to be steel. Even as the temperature in the apartment began to climb noticeably, the air growing heavy and dry. She moved to the window, looking down 14 stories to the street below, where a chaotic ballet of fire trucks and flashing lights had assembled, silent toys in a diorama of disaster. She waved her arms, screaming soundlessly into the glass, hoping a spotlight would catch her, but the smoke billowing from the floors below obscured the facade of the building. There was no way down from the window, no fire escape on this side of the structure, and the drop was a certain death sentence. The reality closed in on her. They were trapped, and the only way out was through the hallway she had just seen burning. The smoke in the apartment was thickening, dropping from the ceiling like a lowering sky, forcing her to crouch slightly to keep breathing relatively clean air. She looked at the front door again, noticing that the paint around the frame was beginning to blister and bubble, the heat radiating from the metal becoming a tangible force pushing into the room. The fire was hungry, and it was scratching at the barrier, demanding entry with a persistence that defied the laws of probability. Elena knew that staying in the apartment meant suffocation or incineration. The fire department would not reach the 14th floor in time to save them from the smoke inhalation. She ran to the bathroom, Leo clinging to her neck, and turned on the shower and the sink, soaking every towel she could find in cold water. Her mind raced through the safety manuals she had read years ago, fragments of information about wet cloth and smoke filtration surfacing from her subconscious. She grabbed a thick wool blanket from the closet and threw it into the bathtub, stomping on it until it was heavy and sodden with water. The sensory details were overwhelming. The smell was now choking, an acrid taste of sulfur and melting rubber, and the heat was making her sweat instantly, her clothes sticking to her back. Elena wrapped the dripping wet towels around her head and face, fashioning a crude filtration mask, and then took the heavy, wet wool blanket and draped it over Leo, creating a cocoon that completely encompassed him. She could feel him struggling against the weight and the wetness, his small fists punching against her chest, but she held him tighter, whispering vibrations of reassurance against his forehead. She checked the hallway one last time, her hand hovering over the doorknob, feeling the scorching heat that promised pain and scarring. She took a deep breath of the cleanest air near the floor, her lungs expanding to their limit, preparing for the plunge into the toxic atmosphere. With a final, silent prayer directed at no specific deity but at the universe itself, Eleanor unlocked the deadbolt and turned the handle. The door flew open, not from her pushing, but sucked inward by the draft of the fire, revealing a corridor that had transformed into a tunnel of swirling black and violent orange. The heat hit her like a physical blow, a solid wall of 1650 feet de kiefer that instantly singed her eyebrows and dried the moisture in her eyes. There was no sound for her, only the visual violence of the flames licking the ceiling and the terrifying vibration of the building groaning under the thermal stress as she stepped into the inferno. The hallway was not merely hot, it was an environment hostile to biological life, a kiln where the air itself seemed to be burning. For a hearing person, the roar would have been deafening, like a jet engine inside a tunnel, but for Eleanor, the horror was entirely tactile and visual. The flames danced with a terrifying silent elegance, curling along the wallpaper and melting the light fixtures into dripping stalactites of plastic. She dropped to her knees instantly, the heat forcing her down, clutching the wet bundle that contained her son against her chest, her own body serving as the primary shield against the thermal radiation. Crawling was a torture of agonizing friction and heat. The synthetic carpet was melting into a sticky, scorching sludge that adhered to her knees and shins, burning through her pajama pants. Every inch of forward movement required a supreme act of will, a battle between the biological imperative to flee the pain and the maternal imperative to protect the child. She kept her head low, practically scraping the floor, where a thin layer of oxygen still existed beneath the billowing, opaque smoke. Her eyes streamed with tears from the irritation, blurring her vision until the world became a smudge of red and black, a nightmare painting come to life. She navigated by memory and touch, counting the doorframes she passed on her right, 14C, 14D, knowing that the stairwell was past 14F. The smoke was so dense it felt solid, a suffocating wool clogging her nose and throat despite the wet towel wrapped around her face. She felt Leo squirming violently against her, his distress vibrating through her ribs, a constant reminder that he was alive, that he was terrified, and that he was depending entirely on her ability to endure the unendurable. She tightened her grip, her knuckles white, the wet wool blanket steaming as the intense heat began to evaporate the water she had soaked it in. A piece of the ceiling grid collapsed a few feet in front of her, showering the hallway with sparks and debris, a silent explosion of light. Elena recoiled, curling around Leo like a pill bug, waiting for the impact of falling debris that she couldn't hear coming. A burning slat of wood struck her shoulder, searing the skin through her thin shirt, but she bit through her lip to keep from screaming, channeling the pain into adrenaline. She pushed the debris aside with a blistered hand and continued her crawl, her movements becoming jerky and desperate as the oxygen levels in her blood began to drop. The heat was affecting her cognitive functions. Her thoughts were becoming sluggish, a thick syrup in her mind. She hallucinated for a moment, seeing the cool blue of the ocean before the searing reality of the hallway snapped her back. She reached the door of 14E and felt the handle. It was locked, and the wood was hot. There was no refuge here. The conflict was internal now, the urge to just lie down, to let the darkness take her, warred with the fierce primal love for the weight in her arms. She looked down at the bundle. A small gap in the blanket revealed Leo's eye, wide with panic, staring up at her. That single eye was the fuel she needed. She forced herself forward, dragging her body over the ruined floor, her skin screaming in protest. The hallway seemed to stretch into infinity, the perspective distorted by the heat haze and the smoke. To her left, an apartment door had burned through completely, revealing a living room fully engulfed in flames, a furnace that radiated a heat so intense it felt like it was pushing her physically against the opposite wall. She turned her face away, shielding Leo's head with her hand, the skin on the back of her hand blistering instantly from the radiant energy. Elena realized she was losing her orientation. Without auditory cues to help locate the source of the fire or the sound of the stairwell door opening, she was navigating purely on visual landmarks that were being destroyed by the second. She felt the floor vibrate violently, perhaps a collapse on the floor above or below, and the building shuddered. The vibration was a language she understood. Instability. The structure was weakening. She had to move faster, despite the exhaustion that pulled at her muscles like gravity on Jupiter. She reached the end of the hallway, or where she thought the end should be, but her hand met a fallen beam instead of the push bar of the stairwell door. Panic flared, cold and sharp amidst the heat. She groped blindly in the smoke, her fingers searching for the metal bar, her lungs burning as if she had inhaled broken glass. The smoke was so thick now she couldn't see her own hands. She was blind in a silent void of heat. She used the wall as a guide, feeling the texture of the bubbling paint, until her fingers brushed against cool metal, the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The pressure differential or debris on the other side had jammed it. Elena slammed her body against the door, feeling the impact reverberate through her shoulder, but it held fast. She screamed, a sound she couldn't hear, a guttural release of frustration and terror. She backed up on her knees, cradling Leo with one arm, and threw herself at the bar again and again, using her shoulder as a battering ram. The vibration of her impacts travelled up her arm, a rhythmic thudding against the steel. On the third hit, the latch gave way with a shudder she felt in her teeth. The door swung open, and she fell forward onto the concrete landing of the stairwell. The air here was cooler, though still filled with smoke, but the immediate, searing, radiant heat of the hallway was gone. She scrambled to pull the door shut behind her, using her foot to leverage it against the suction of the fire, cutting off the dragon that had been chasing them. She leaned against the concrete wall, gasping for air, clutching Leo so tightly she feared she might crush him, checking the vibration of his chest to ensure he was still breathing. But the relief was short-lived. As she looked up the stairwell, she saw smoke pouring down from the upper floors, and looking down, she saw a thick, impenetrable column of black rising from below. The fire was not just on her floor. It had compromised the stairwell lower down. They were in a chimney. The conflict shifted again, go up to the roof and hope for a helicopter, or push down through the smoke and hope to pass the fire floor below. She felt the vibration of footsteps pounding somewhere above her. Firefighters or other fleeing residents? She couldn't tell. She made the choice to go down. The roof could be a trap if the access door was locked or if the wind was blowing the smoke across the helipad. Down meant towards the street, towards help. She stood up, her legs trembling uncontrollably, her knees raw and bleeding, and began the descent. 1 step, 2 steps. The silence of the stairwell was eerie. She knew it must be echoing with shouts and sirens, but for her it was a silent movie of despair. She wrapped the drying blanket tighter around Leo, his weight the only anchor keeping her from floating away into unconsciousness. The descent was a descent into a deeper circle of hell. By the 12th floor, the smoke in the stairwell was so thick that the emergency lights were mere glowing halos in the gloom, offering no real illumination. Elena moved by feeling the railing, her hand sliding down the cold metal that was rapidly warming up. Her breathing was ragged, her throat swollen from the toxins she had already inhaled. Every breath tasted like ash and chemical death. She stumbled, her foot missing a step, and she slammed against the wall to avoid falling forward, shielding Leo's head from the concrete with her forearm. As she reached the 10th floor landing, the heat spiked dramatically. The fire on the lower floors had breached the stairwell containment. She could see the paint on the stairwell doors peeling, and the concrete under her feet felt hot through her thin soles. She paused, swaying, her vision tunneling. The oxygen deprivation was taking its toll. Black spots danced in her eyes, merging with the smoke. She felt a profound vibration shake the stairs. Something massive had collapsed nearby. The structural integrity of the building was failing. She pressed on, but her body was beginning to revolt. Her muscles were failing, lactic acid building up to agonizing levels. She sank to her knees again, unable to trust her legs. She would crawl down the stairs if she had to. She lowered herself, bumping down each step on her backside, clutching Leo to her chest. The motion was slow, agonizingly slow. She could feel the heat rising up the shaft like a physical wind, drying her eyes until blinking was painful. Suddenly, the door to the 8th floor burst open, not by a person, but by a backdraft explosion from the hallway. A tongue of fire lashed into the stairwell, engulfing the landing below her. Elena recoiled, pressing herself back against the stairs, covering Leo completely with her body. The heat was instantaneous and ferocious, singeing the hair on her arms and blistering the skin on her back. She couldn't go down. The path was blocked by a wall of fire. She looked up. The smoke was thicker there. She was trapped between the fire below and the suffocation above. This was the breaking point, the realization that all her effort, all her pain, might have been for nothing, shattered her resolve for a split second. She curled up on the landing between the 9th and 8th floors, the concrete rough against her cheek. She looked at Leo beneath the blanket. He was still, his eyes closed, his face pale in the gloom. Was he unconscious? Was he dead? She placed her hand on his chest, waiting for the rise and fall. It was there, faint, rapid, terrified fluttering. He was alive. That flutter broke her despair. She couldn't die here, not with him. She looked at the standpipe valve on the wall of the landing, the connection for the fire hoses. It was leaking slightly, a trickle of water running down the concrete. She dragged herself to it, wetting her hands, wetting the blanket over Leo again. It was a pathetic defense against an inferno, but it was something. She huddled in the corner, furthest from the flames below, pressing herself into the junction of the wall and floor, making herself as small as possible. The heat was becoming unbearable. She could feel her skin tightening, the moisture evaporating from her body. She was being cooked alive. She wrapped her arms around Leo, burying her face in the wet wool, creating a small pocket of cooler air for him to breathe. She decided then that she would not move. She would become stone. She would become a shield. She closed her eyes, shutting out the visual horror, retreating into the silence of her mind, where only the sensation of Leo's heartbeat existed. Time lost its meaning. It could have been minutes or hours. The vibration of the building was constant now, a shuddering beast dying. She felt a new vibration, sharper, more rhythmic. Thump, thump, thump. Not the building. Steps. Heavy steps coming up from below, through the fire. She opened her eyes, but saw only grey and black. She couldn't scream. Her throat was too parched. She reached out one hand, waving it feebly in the darkness, a silent plea in the void. A shape emerged from the smoke below, a hulking, monstrous silhouette with a glowing eye. It was a firefighter, fully geared, moving through the flames that had blocked her path. He didn't see her at first. He was focused on hauling a heavy hose up the stairs. Elena grabbed a loose piece of concrete debris and threw it. It hit his helmet. He stopped, turning his head. The beam of his flashlight cut through the smoke and landed on her. A woman curled in the corner, covered in soot, skin red and raw, clutching a bundle. He moved instantly, rushing up the few steps to reach her. She felt his gloved hands on her shoulders, shaking her. He was saying something, shouting probably, but she saw only his masked face. She pointed frantically to the bundle in her arms. The baby. He understood. He reached for Leo, but Eleanor refused to let go. Her arms were locked in a rigor of protection. She would not be separated, not here, not now. The firefighter, recognizing the hysteria and the bond, didn't fight her. He grabbed her harness, hauled her to her feet, and shielded them both with his turnout coat as they turned to face the fire below. The descent with the firefighter was a blur of motion and sensory overload. He practically carried her, his arm a steel bar around her waist, guiding her through the breach on the 8th floor where the hose team had knocked back the flames. Eleanor saw the water spraying, the steam exploding white and scalding, mixing with the black smoke. She felt the vibrations of the high-pressure water hitting the walls, a violent shuddering that rivaled the fire itself. They moved past other firefighters who were shouting orders she couldn't hear, their faces obscured by masks, looking like aliens in a toxic landscape. When they finally burst out of the stairwell door and into the lobby, the cold winter air rushing in from the shattered front entrance hit Eleanor like a shockwave. The transition from 1650 feet de Gruff to freezing December wind sent her body into immediate shock. She collapsed on the wet marble floor of the lobby, her legs no longer obeying her brain's commands. The firefighter was yelling for medics, waving his arms, but to Eleanor the scene was a silent, chaotic pantomime. Flashing red and blue lights strobed across the walls, dizzying and disorienting. Paramedics swarmed them. Hands were everywhere, touching her face, checking her pulse, trying to take the bundle from her arms. Elena fought them weakly, her grip on Leo still ironclad. She needed to see him. She needed to know. A female paramedic, realizing the situation, gently pried Elena's fingers loose, maintaining eye contact, her expression calm and reassuring. She pulled back the scorched, soot-stained wool blanket. Elena craned her neck, ignoring the screaming pain in her burned back, to look. Leo was crying. His face was stained with soot, and he was coughing, his small body convulsing, but he was pink where the skin was clean. He was alive. He was moving. The relief was so profound it felt like a physical organ failure. Elena's vision went white, and she slumped back against the stretcher they had wheeled under her. She felt the vibration of the ambulance engine idling nearby, a deep, rumbling purr that signaled safety. They placed an oxygen mask over her face, the cool gas flowing into her ravaged lungs, tasting sweet and pure. They were loaded into separate ambulances. Protocol demanded it, given her injuries. Elena panicked as they took Leo away, reaching out, her silent scream tearing at her throat. The paramedic held her shoulders down, pointing to her own eyes and then to the ambulance ahead, nodding vigorously. He is okay. He is going. Elena watched through the back windows as the doors closed on her son. She was alone again in her silence, but this time her body was broken. The adrenaline faded, replaced by the agony of second-degree burns across her shoulders, back and arms, where the fire had kissed her as she shielded her child. The ride to the hospital was a series of vibrations, the swaying of the vehicle, the bumps in the road, the rhythmic chest compressions of the paramedic checking her vitals. She watched the IV drip, the liquid counting down the moments. Her mind replayed the hallway, the heat, the darkness. The trauma was setting in, etching itself into her psyche. She looked at her hands, swollen, blistered, the nails black with soot. These hands had crawled through hell. At the trauma center, the chaos intensified. Doctors and nurses moved with frantic efficiency, cutting off her clothes, scrubbing the burns. A pain so intense she arched off the table, screaming soundlessly. They sedated her, the drugs sliding into her veins like warm ice. The lights above dimmed, the frantic faces blurred. Her last conscious thought was the vibration of the floor in the apartment, the signal that had saved them, the silence that had been both her enemy and her savior. She woke up hours, or perhaps days later, in a sterile white room. The air was cool and smelled of antiseptic. Her body was wrapped in bandages, stiff and sore. She tried to sit up but couldn't. A nurse appeared in her peripheral vision, smiling gently. She wrote on a whiteboard, "You are safe. New York Presbyterian Hospital." Elena motioned with her hand, a desperate mimicry of rocking a baby. The nurse nodded and wrote again, "Baby Leo is in PICU. Smoke inhalation. Stable. He will be fine." Elena closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, the silence felt empty without the vibration of his heart against hers. Recovery was a slow, grueling process of tissue regeneration and skin grafts. Eleanor spent 3 weeks in the burn unit. Her back was a map of scars, a permanent testimony to the night the world burned. The physical therapy was agonizing, stretching skin that wanted to shrink and tighten. But she endured it with a stoic silence that earned the respect of the hospital staff. She learned that the fire had claimed 6 lives that night. She and Leo were the only survivors from the 14th floor. The day she was allowed to see Leo was the first day she felt truly alive since the fire. They wheeled her into the pediatric ward. He was in a crib, breathing without a ventilator now, playing with a soft toy. When he saw her, his face lit up, and he reached out his arms. Elena wept, silent tears tracking through the healing skin of her cheeks. She picked him up, ignoring the pain in her own arms, and pressed him to her chest. She felt the vibration of his coo, the solid reality of his weight. He was heavier, or maybe she was just weaker, but he was there. The story of the silent savior had made the news. People marveled at how a deaf woman could navigate a zero-visibility inferno. They didn't understand that for Elena, the world had always been navigated by touch, by vibration, by instinct. The fire had stripped away the advantages of the hearing, the shouts, the alarms, and leveled the playing field to a primal test of endurance. She hadn't survived despite her deafness. She had survived because she knew how to listen to the floor, to the walls, to the unspoken language of physical things. 6 months later, Elena stood in a new apartment in Queens. It was on the 2nd floor. She refused to live high up again. The window looked out onto a quiet street. She held Leo, now walking and stumbling around the carpet. She touched the wall of the new nursery. It was cool, solid, safe. She had installed high-intensity strobe alarms in every room and a bed shaker that would wake the dead. She would never trust the silence again, not fully. She walked to the mirror in the hallway and looked at her back, visible through the open cut of her summer dress. The scars were pink and raised, an ugly, jagged pattern that looked like fire frozen in flesh. She traced them with her fingertips. They were not ugly to her. They were armor. They were the proof that when the world turned to ash and noise, love was the loudest thing in existence, vibrating through the floorboards, crawling through the dark, refusing to burn. Eleanor turned from the mirror and watched Leo laugh at a dust mote dancing in a sunbeam. She couldn't hear his laugh, but she saw the joy radiating from him, filling the room with a light brighter than any fire. She placed her hand on the floorboards, feeling the thud, thud, thud of his clumsy steps. It was the most beautiful music she had ever known. She smiled, picked him up and kissed the top of his head, ready to live the life she had snatched back from the flames.